Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to everybody joining this webinar tonight. My name is Amjad Iraqi. I am a senior editor at 972 Magazine, and I will be your host slash moderator for this evening. We're just going to take another minute or two as people slowly start to trickle in. I'm actually going to borrow a little tactic from some colleagues of ours. For those who are already joining in, we'd love to actually kind of see and hear where some of you are watching in from, what cities, what countries. It's always curious to see where a lot of our fans and followers are. So feel free to take the next minute. Let's see where some people are from. You can write this in the chat box right at the bottom there. This is a good chance to say that I myself am calling in from Haifa. Vera is also joining in from the same city, and Oren is calling in from Tel Aviv. People too shy to say where they're from. No worries at all. Here we are, we're getting in more and more participants. Let's give them a few more seconds. There we go. We got a watcher from Montreal, San Francisco, Oxford, Stockholm, Chicago, Tel Aviv, Boston, Ashland, Dubai, greetings from Indianapolis. Oh, wow. Oh, fantastic. Got a lot of people from the United States, from states all over, and from Canada. Oh, wow, astounding. You can also see this also in the chat box. Wow, I can't even keep up with everyone. Thank you all so much. Wow, this is really impressive to see. We're really glad that so many of you are following our work from near and far, Johannesburg as well in South Africa. I'm a big fan of the city. I think we can officially kick off. Thanks so much for all of you. I'm glad that we have such a large community. So just to reintroduce myself again, my name is Amjad Iraqi. I'm a senior editor at 972 Magazine and the moderator for this evening. Before I introduce our guests, I'm sure many of you already know what 972 Magazine is, but just to kind of get a pitch of who we are. So 972 was actually founded in 2010. By a group of Palestinian and Israeli journalists and activists who are really setting out to kind of set new terms of media work and media discourse. It came to Israel-Palestine, and in all those years since 2010 has really helped to shape and evolve a lot of those debates in the international and English media. Our site is run under our parent NGO, 972 Magazine, and through that we also have our kind of partner site called Local Call or Sicha Mekomit, which works in Hebrew and is a joint cooperation between 972 and the organization Just Vision, who we highly also recommend looking at all their work. And I'll go a bit more into why we're having this particular evening, but just to lay out the quick technical rules. Some of you, I'm sure, have gone through these Zoom events many times before. So the chat box, please try to reserve for kind of any technical questions or issues like that. Basically, for the first half hour of this discussion, I'll be speaking with Oren and Vera, with a couple of set prepared questions, and then we will open the next half hour for questions and answers. And if you will look at the bottom of your Zoom page, you'll see that there's that Q&A box. So feel free at any point from now or even later to throw in any questions you would like to ask of our panelists, and we will get to that as soon as we arrive at that stage. So yeah, I think that sets out all the kind of the house rules, as it were. And just to quickly briefly introduce our guest today, we have Vera Sajrawi, who is a editor and a correspondent / reporter at 972 Magazine, as I said, based here in Haifa. We're thrilled to have you. And we also have Oren, who is a reporter with Local Call and with 972. And both these journalists have been longtime kind of readers and obviously workers, reporters for 972 and Local Call, covering many different aspects of Israel-Palestine on the ground with vast amounts of experience. And I'm learning from them as much as I'm sure many of you are about to. And so why are we bringing Oren and Vera here and why we're having this conversation? I'm sure many of you are following constantly what is developing in Israel-Palestine, but a major reason why we decided to have this discussion is that past month, especially everything that's happening that has been happening since the beginning of July up until literally a few days ago, to put it bluntly, it's been quite significant. It's been very pivotal, and there have been a lot of major events that have been affecting Palestinians and Israelis between the river and the sea. If you flash backwards up to the very beginning of July, many of you, I'm sure, were seeing Israel's 2-day invasion of the Jenin refugee camp in the northern West Bank, which was not just some regular military operation. It was actually one of the largest such operations in the occupied West Bank in quite a number of years, not only in terms of the ground offensive, but also the return of aerial strikes in such a concentrated area. This itself did not happen in a vacuum. Over the past year and a half, the Israeli military has actually been conducting a protracted operation in the West Bank, especially in the north, places like Jenin and Nablus, going on almost weekly into these cities, into the refugee camps. And there's been this long protracted confrontation between soldiers and Palestinian armed groups in these areas. But even in the days before the Jenin invasion happened, you actually saw this massive surge of Israeli settler violence, or to be blunt, settler pogroms against quite a few Palestinian communities. And both Vera and Oren have been tracking and following both the military and the settler violence that has been conducted there. And so this was really this kind of heating up and accumulation of many events that led to this particular invasion. Unfortunately, the moment the invasion stopped, many people kind of forgot what's been happening in the West Bank, and we hope to kind of put back the spotlight a little bit there. But what has also dominated the news cycle, as I'm sure you all know as well, is this massive Israeli protest movement against the far-right government, and particularly what is described as its judicial overhaul or judicial coup. And last year, I'm sure many of you have seen that the Knesset officially passed the first major bill in this judicial overhaul package, striking down what's called the reasonableness clause, which basically strips some of the powers of the Supreme Courts to override the government on a decision deems unreasonable. We'll unpack many of these things and speak more about everything that happened from the beginning to the end of this month. And we'll be drawing from Vera's and Oren's reporting expertise and their observations on this. And like I said, feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom to throw in your questions, and we'll get and so let's kick off actually with Vera. So Vera, it's been nearly a month since the Jenin invasion happened, but the effects on Palestinian society, both inside the refugee camp and in the wider area and across Palestine, these effects are still being felt up till now. So from your reporting and your observations and all this, how are you seeing Palestinians reflecting on what happened during that invasion, and how have they been, or how have you been seeing they are recovering or reorganizing ever since that operation?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I actually cannot believe that July was only 1 month. It felt like a year. The events that happened that you mentioned, Amjad, were very heavy on the Palestinian population, especially inside the camp. The invasion was sudden, first of all. And the way that Israel handled the whole situation reminded people of the Jenin refugee camp massacre in 2002. While I myself was in high school, a lot of people who live inside the camp were also alive in 2002 and witnessed what happened. So imagine the Israeli army just invading the really small camp. I think it's 1 kilometer, with really crowded, densely populated neighborhoods. I think I should call it like one big neighborhood. So imagine the Israeli army with its force and arm invading the camp, and that brings horrific memories to camp residents who witnessed the massacre in 2002, and also takes a toll on younger generation, kids, mothers, patients of different illnesses. The water and sewage and electricity was heavily destroyed. So people in the heat of July, which was recorded as the hottest month in record, didn't have access to basics. Food started running out, and we saw the scenes of the army ordering families to leave in the middle of the night because they wanted to advance farther inside the camp and clash with fighters. And just seeing these images brought back, I could guarantee you that any Palestinian or anyone with knowledge of Palestinian history remembered the Nakba, because these are families walking with only the clothes on their bodies and escaping for their lives. So it took a heavy toll on everyone, toll on every Palestinian and every ally and every person that cares about human rights. Kids, children, women, and elderly and patients should not be caught up in this situation. We should not witness another Nakba in 2023. We should not allow such things to happen. So for that to happen, it was terrifying and disappointing. The thing is with Palestinians, especially in refugee camps, they know how to bounce back from whatever happens. These people are subjected to living under blockade for years. And they know how to survive. They know how to bounce back. I think during my reporting and my interviews, I noticed that their spirits are really high, and they were sad, of course, and disoriented about how to pick up things from there. But I think me, even being away and a journalist, I was more broken and terrified than the people that I spoke to in the refugee camp. I'm not saying they're not traumatized, they're not re-traumatized and sad and lost many things, but I'm saying that they have this ability to bounce back from really tough situations. Maybe because the Israeli army raids the camp every single night almost. We're talking about nightly raids, not only in Jenin, but all over the West Bank. They arrest children while they're sleeping. I think this knows how horrific it is to live under occupation, military apartheid. But I saw, for example, the Freedom Theater, which is a theater that has been around in Jenin for a while. They had a street parade with the dolls and clowns, and it was heartwarming to see that those same kids who were crying, like not able to even find shelter for a few hours for those who escaped the camp, now dancing and playing with clowns and singing. I reported about many donations that came from Palestinians, either who live inside Israel or in different cities in the bank. People in Jenin opened their houses and hosted the families that fled the invasion. I know about bakeries who delivered fresh bread, hotels. There's this one hotel that gave all the rooms to the Palestinians who fled the refugee camp. So again, it was horrific and terrifying to see, and it re-traumatized Palestinians back to remembering Nakba and back to remembering the 2002 massacre, but also the way that I find a little bit of peace in the way that I witnessed Palestinians in Jenin refugee camp bounce back to life and try to get their life together again. Their strength is very inspiring.
Thanks so much, Vera. And you're exactly right. This kind of duality of both the severe brutality and oppression, but also the agency of the Palestinian community to try to push back and to recover and to create that solidarity. Even actually in the chat box, we've shared some of Vera's articles reporting on some of this, and you can also find this on our website at 972mag.com. I highly encourage reading those articles. So let's now move to Oren. So Oren, for months you've been photographing and reporting on the rise of Israeli settler violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, including in towns like Hawara and Tumus Aya, where you were also just like in the days and the months right before the Jenin invasion itself. And I'm curious, in all your reporting and being on the ground and speaking with a lot of communities there, documenting all this, what have you been seeing what are you feeling is different about these particular waves of settler attacks that we've been witnessing, like compared to previous years? And how much are you sensing that these attacks are also being influenced by this current far-right government? There's been a lot of conversation about, the sort of confluence and how they sort of feed off each other, but I'm curious how you've been witnessing this on the ground these past few months. Oh, just unmute yourself, Oren.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thank you, Amjad, and thank you, Vera. I'm glad to be here today with you in this discussion. I think we cannot disconnect the rise of settler violence or settler pogroms or settler violence backed by the army from the current government. We've seen for years rise in the attacks, in the violence, in the Israeli authorities basically doing nothing to prevent it or even encouraging it, as we reported in 9/17 local call through the years. But I think we have seen a change, especially in Hawara, starting from Hawara a few months ago, that we've seen hundreds of settlers for hours going down from the settlement, attacking houses, cars, attacking property, almost burning families in their homes. And the army just being present there. And the only major thing the army and the police did was blocking the road. So help and assistance from Nablus, from other cities could come, like firefighters, medics, and just civilians who wanted to help their relatives or friends. So I think the changes that settlers have much more confidence. It's not, as Israel is trying to present it, as a small minority of violent radical settlers. No, they're backed up by the politicians who don't do anything to prevent it, to the villages and the local security who allow them to go in and out and don't prevent it, and of course don't hand any information to the police when they do investigate. I think so. It's not only the amount of people, but it's also the courage and the feeling that they won't be accountable. They won't be held accountable. We're talking about hundreds of people in Hawara. Some of them have been documented, some of them leaving bottles or other things the police could investigate. And the police is doing nothing. And even when people complain to the police doesn't investigate. And these people feel some kind of, that they're protected and they cannot be arrested. I think in all the Hawara events, we had 4 or 5 people being arrested and most of them released. Sometimes the army does deal with it's important to understand that many of the people who take part in these pogroms are soldiers on vacation or while at home. So they have automatic rifles, they have military knowledge, and they're leading or taking a critical part in those attacks. I think also, if in the past this kind of attacks would be a graffiti or burning a car here or there, now it's really breaking into houses, really trying to set families on fire while they're inside, burning hundreds of cars, and then no one from the leadership, from the settler leadership to the government, which is basically the same thing today, doesn't want to talk about it, to even say some basic things that it's wrong. They're calling it youth who are damaging property. This is how they're phrasing it, and of course it's not the case. It's hard to compare because, of course, under apartheid, the reality settlers lives in and Palestinians live in, it's uncomparable. But of course, if Palestinians would do 1% of it, there would be hundreds of arrests, and the army would raid their villages and close them off, and so on and so on. And we've seen, following the pogroms, the army actually closing Hawara, closing shop for the security of the Palestinian, putting more roadblocks, and so on. I think on the political level, these events really shocked many people, even mainstream people, the US administration and other people, because it's something we haven't seen in the past, this kind of attack against unarmed civilians, and not during some riots or something else. So I think in some way it managed to shock a lot of people, and Hawara became a symbol to this phenomenon where settlers just do whatever they want and nobody's holding them accountable.
Thanks, Oren. Those are really important points. This kind of describing the synergy exactly between these settlers on the ground, plus the army that's accompanying them, plus the politicians really backing them up, and how this is all really interconnected, despite their attempts to kind of isolate each other and say, like you said, this is kind of like a one-off thing. It is actually part and parcel of the system and a run-of-the-mill that's really operating quite a bit.
Yeah, if I may add one thing, I think since Hawara, we've seen this thing just becoming a standard. So the Israeli authorities and also us, we're getting used to the fact that, so we had Turmusaya afterwards and Lubana Sharkiya, just settlers going in, maybe not in hundreds, but in dozens, burning property. In Turmusaya, it was on daylight, also the army shooting a US citizen. And again, it got a lot of attention because this is a village of Palestinians with dual citizenship, and the man who was killed had an American green card. So there was a lot of attention around it. But if those were not Palestinian Americans, it would be forgotten quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen them already. Oren has been, like I said, reporting on this quite a bit. He has several articles in the past weeks and months covering some of these villages, and not only reporting and talking to people, also just like very harrowing photographs, which I highly encourage you all to see and follow on the site. I want to come back to Vera now. So, in this kind of larger structure of the occupation, there's also another critical piece that also needs to be brought in. So one of the ripple effects of the Jenin invasion has been this growing discontent, or much more kind of evident growing discontent among the Palestinian public against the Palestinian Authority run by Mahmoud Abbas, and which basically governs the occupied West Bank, with, of course, Hamas running the Gaza Strip, but with PA kind of assuming sort of political leadership role. And basically during that Jenin invasion, the was practically absent. This idea that there's supposed to be this kind of pseudo government for the Palestinians was just clearly not evident, neither in protection or even in support. And that you even saw some kind of pushback and protest by some people from Jenin when some PA officials came. So I'm curious, how have you been seeing these conversations among Palestinians about both their political leadership and also these armed and resistance groups in places like the Jenin refugee camp and in Nablus? How are you seeing Palestinians talking about all this in the past month? And with all this as well, do you get the sense at all that the PA, being so deeply integrated into the occupation and with so much public opposition to it, do you feel that the PA is somehow feeling under pressure over the past few weeks, or do you feel like it's more or less the same?
I don't feel that the PA is feeling any pressure, because the PA is backed by the US and backed, of course, it's a subcontractor of the occupation. A lot of Palestinians look at it as deeply contributing to the occupation as much as Israel, I want to say, because we all know how the PA is actually an arm, let's say, of Israel. And when this authority, let's talk about the Palestinian Authority, is supported by the US, I don't think the people have luxury or the privilege of starting, I don't know, coup or a revolution, and especially after the suppression of the revolutions during the Arab Spring. Yes, people came out and spoke against the PA in Jenin because their blood was boiling, and they were very angry that the PA, of course, nobody expected the PA to step in and defend Jenin. That never happened. There wasn't expectation, but people still were very mad to see that the PA forces just disappeared from Jenin district. They didn't just like leave the refugee camp, or the outskirts. They left the whole district to the Israeli army to do whatever they please. So Palestinians were disappointed. They voiced that disappointed, but we all also know that the PA has an iron fist. It arrests journalists, activists. It kills activists, as we saw in the killing of Palestinian activist Nizar Banat. So it's a very brutal authority, and standing up for it might cost you your life. They use, of course, different ways to terrorize their own people. As I mentioned, the arrests, the killing, arresting journalists, canceling events that they don't agree with. So Palestinians are realistic about how much they can do. When you're living, I see it as living under double occupation and under an apartheid wall. You have to apply for permits to leave the territories, the West Bank. So yes, there is anger. This anger has been boiling under the surface for decades, I want to say. But I don't think there is a revolution coming. I don't think there is a way out as long as the UN supports both Israel and the PA, and as long as they have Western allies. It's almost impossible for me to imagine a revolution or overthrowing the PA.
This is a very critical point because there's been a lot of discussion, in recent years about the PA and the sustainability of it, and always talking about it as being on the brink, and especially even being in confrontation with the Israeli government. But what the reality is, like you explained, like not only is the PA intricately tied to the Oslo structure since the 1990s, it relies on them, it relies on its cooperation with the Israeli security authorities, of the Israeli economic system, and how the PA itself has also really infiltrated Palestinian society through politics, economics, etc., and in all these different ways. So the idea of the PA just being a very brittle organization, and not brittle at the same time because of these massive structures and interests. So it's important also for our audiences to also be aware, like, yes, Israel and the PA are technically supposed to be at loggerheads with each other, but in fact, they rely on each other a lot. And Israeli politicians and security officials say this as well. So it's crucial to always sometimes look behind those initial headlines and the screamings and the shoutings of certain politicians. So yeah, thank you, Vera, for pointing a lot of those details out. Now, speaking of public discontent with one's leadership, Oren, I want to come back to you and actually look at the Israeli side of this. So every week since December, January, you've been documenting these mass Israeli protests against the far-right government, and particularly against its judicial coup plans. You've been documenting also things like the involvement of youth in these demonstrations, and also like the tensions between the more sort of radical anti-occupation bloc that's been showing up these protests and their tensions with the more mainstream protest movements, and a lot of really excellent reporting that I highly encourage everyone to look at. Now, last week, as I mentioned earlier, the Knesset passed its first major law, and this was also like on the heels of a massive escalation by the protest movement. And I'm curious, from your reporting and observations, what are you seeing the anti-government movement is thinking in terms of its next steps from the small victory that the government has just notched up? Do you see the protests and the movement radicalizing further, either in their tactics or their discourse? I'm curious to see what sense you're getting over the past week of what's coming next.
Thank you for your question. I have to be honest, though, when the government was formed, and maybe the most extreme government in Israeli history, it was clear there will be some protest movement, but I think personally, but all of us couldn't imagine it will go this far with almost 500,000 people in the streets, being cities in the periphery of Israel, cities like Be'er Sheva, like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and more important that not only the amount of people, the masses, but also that they're protesting every week and willing to confront some of them and to take direct action, block roads, burn barricades, stand in front of increased police violence. It's something we haven't seen the Israeli mostly secular, liberal, middle class, center level. It's hard to define the population, but it's anti-government protests. They never experienced this kind of police brutality. And of course, for us, we've seen this tactics used first and all against Palestinians, but also against ultra-Orthodox and Ethiopians and left-wing activists, radical left-wing activists who go to the West Bank in solidarity. But this is something very unique and special for mainstream Israelis to confront the police and do things that usually are seen as being rioters, as being Palestinian or ultra-Orthodox. So it's a major shift. And in this huge movement, you have a lot of processes. So you could say that some of them, at least the leaders, the more old people, are there to kind of a nostalgic sentiment to the old and good Israel that was democratic, and just Netanyahu and his overhaul are now coming and destroying the democracy. And this is how we started to keep the Israeli democracy. And it's something that is still there. On the other hand, you have, as you mentioned, the more radical activists, the anti-occupation bloc that is doing amazing work from day one, coming with Palestinian flags, with other slogans, and is growing to thousands of people. And some, of course, of the people oppose them, some attack them, but mostly they're accepted there. And they're, of course, bringing the message that they cannot be democracy with occupation, with apartheid for Jews only. They're trying to expand the messages. But recently it seemed, and with the Hawara pogrom and with Ben Gvir and Smotrich in the government, it's hard to ignore the occupation. Even people who don't think it should be on the front, they don't ignore it. Maybe they say we have to, from tactical reason, to attract more mainstream right center people against it, we have to put it aside. But I've done our story that will be published in a few days, talking to more than 20 youth and young protesters, and some of them are not related to our communities or to the anti-occupation local activists, and most of them mention Hawara and the pogroms and something that made them realize they have to go out. And I think something is moving. Is this movement, would this movement become a mass Israeli movement against the apartheid, the colonialism and occupation? I don't think so, but things are moving. We're seeing refusing something that was a taboo in Israeli society, that was only very, very radical left-wing activists refusing to draft. Now, mainstream people, the former chairman of the Shabak is calling on stage to people to refuse, to reserve army, but still to refuse. And we've seen Brothers in Arms movement of ex-soldier blocking the Kiryat, the military headquarters in Tel Aviv. So things are shifting very slowly. This movement is still very mainstream. You see the amount of flags, you see the war criminals going on stage like Tzipi Livni or Ehud Olmert and being accepted there. But I think we have also to separate between the official line, what's going on stage, and the messages sent to the media. And this is again to attract mainstream Israeli and trying to crack into the right, to people who are right-wing but oppose Netanyahu. To the other hand, to what's happening on the ground, mainly youth and young people that don't have this nostalgic feeling towards Israel because they never lived under it. They were born into Netanyahu era after the second Intifada, and basically under this extreme right government, they don't want to fight only the changes in the legal system and the overhaul, but they want women's rights, LGBTQ rights, freedom of religion, and also rights to Palestinians, at least some of them, which are all under attack under this current government. So at least for the young people I'm talking to, it's hard to separate.
Thanks so much, Oren. That's a fantastic sort of like nuanced landscape of what we're facing here. And I think that those complexities and even with a lot of the kind of challenges that this kind of movement poses and the big question marks and even the blind spots, but to actually notice these different shades that are operating within the movement is very fascinating. And again, I encourage everyone to look at Oren's reporting on this and some of the, both from the anti-occupation bloc and the youth and the refuseniks. It's very important to keep an eye on that. I'm noticing a lot of people are already asking questions in the Q&A. That's fantastic. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions you'd like to throw in, please use the Q&A box, and we'll get to it very shortly. I just have one last question that I want to give to Oren and Vera before I turn it over to our audience members. And I hope people don't mind. We might go just like 5 minutes past 9 or something like that. I hope that everyone is getting a lot from this discussion. So a question for both Vera and Oren. Feel free to give jump in whoever would like to start. So the Israeli government is, as you've been describing, clearly pursuing an extremely radical vision for the state and the occupation, and has been putting forward a lot of laws and policies and plans on numerous fronts that will really have far-reaching consequences for everyone living between the river and the sea. In your respective views, and if you can answer this like somewhat briefly, what do you think is either like the most important or the most overlooked issue that you think we should be keeping an eye on in the months ahead that's being advanced by this government or in the resistance to it?
Should I start? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Vera? Okay. I think first of all, it's in local call, we're following the numbers of Palestinians killed in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. And this year already, so 2022 has been the most deadly year since the Second Intifada, since 2005. This was half under Lapid's Bennett government and partly under, or at the edge under Netanyahu's government. But this year, already after 7 months, just in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, there's 166 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. And it's something that is not really talked in the media. It's important also to mention that most of the Palestinians killed by Israeli forces are not killed during attempts to carry attacks or things like that, but mostly while Israeli forces are invading into Palestinian cities in area A and B, places that theoretically under the Oslo Accords should be under Palestinian control. And so either they resist there with weapon or with stones, or they're just outside in the street. I would say 70–80% of the Palestinians killed are doing this kind of nitrate that Vera was talking about it. And if to connect it a bit, the situation inside Israel, I think the Jenin operation or invasion and all what's happening in the West Bank cannot be disconnected from the situation inside Israel, because this operation, first of all, didn't have any military goals. It had political goals from the pressure of the settlers in the government and on the ground to do something to occupy Jenin and so on, and to the attempts of Netanyahu in many different ways to unite the Israeli public and to shift the conversation to security, that it's much more comfortable for him. Till now, it's not really. It's also something unique to this protest movement, that despite that many people are Zionist and patriotic, they don't stop the protest if there's any attacks or casualties or operation, which is something we haven't seen in mainstream center-left political movement in the past. In the past, if there was anything in Gaza or some attacks inside Israel, they would hold all the demonstration and cancel them. And this haven't been happening in the last 7 months. So I think it's important also to see the connection between what the government is making in the West Bank and the political they're trying to achieve inside Israel.
Thanks, Oren. Vera?
Beautifully put, Oren. I think the most important thing to keep an eye on is humanizing the Palestinians in any way possible. I see international media talking about my people in a very negative lens. For example, after the Jenin invasion, let's find out how the Jenin refugee camp came to exist in the first place. These people are displaced from 1948. I want people to humanize us, to know the backstory. Israel is not going to tell you the backstory. International media is not going to, most international media is not going to tell you the backstory. So you need to do your homework and change your perspective about what's going on here, and change your attitude towards Palestinians and what's happening. These people live under occupation, and they need help and humanizing and understanding. There are many, many ways to help, starting from donations, talent exchange, supporting real journalism. We need practical steps on the ground. If we keep acting individually, it's not going to amount to a big act. We need to act collectively. We need to build a base of activists that support in many different ways, even from abroad, and just tell the truth and stand up to apartheid, to occupation, to the lies, to the negative lens that Palestinians are painted with, are looked at with. And that's, I think, the way to go.
Thanks so much for that, Vera, and to Oren. I mean, this is actually a good point to also mention. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, are thinking of all sorts of ways to support people who are kind of fighting for social justice, or an end to the occupation, or an end to apartheid in all means necessary. We're glad that many people are providing that support. And, you know, 972 is just one small piece of this much larger kind of movement and effort to bring these principles of equality and equity and of justice and human rights for everybody here. And the kind of reporting that both Vera and Oren are involved with, you know, also relies a lot on your kind of support and your involvement in 972. And I'll speak a bit more about this towards the end, but also feel that to know that we as journalists, you know, as like activist journalists even, that we see ourselves as part of this effort to change that conversation, to play our role, to cover what's happening on the ground, and to reflect what the communities are speaking about. So to also speak about 972 in this wider place. And with that, I now want to turn to some of the questions we've been getting. Feel free to keep throwing in a few more. We've been getting some good questions. I'm going to sort of fuse a couple of them together. I actually want to start with a question that's been popping up quite a bit over the past few months regarding the judicial coup. So a lot of people have been discussing the judicial plans, mostly in terms of what it means for Israelis, and what it means for the system of government, and about the executive branch, et cetera, and obviously seeing this mass protest movement. But one of the questions asked here, which we get a lot, is actually, how will this judicial coup affect Palestinians? How much are they actually in this plan for the government to override the Supreme Court? And trying to unpack that a little bit more. Oren or Vera, feel free to jump in where we'd like to start by answering that.
It's your turn. Okay, I'll start. I think, despite the fact, understandable reasons, Palestinians inside Israel, inside 48, are not taking part in the protest because of their nationalistic approach and all the flags and all that. It's very clear, and this is also experts are saying, and also activists, and also, you know, the Palestinian organizations inside 48. It's very clear that like every activity of the Israeli government, the first victims will be Palestinians, both in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and inside Israel. And this is, and I think this is why the settlers, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, are so enthusiastic to promote this, because it's not that the Supreme Court have been ever protecting Palestinians, and usually in security matters or occupation matters, usually it's been backing up the state. But still, from time to time, settlements, like we see in the Homesh case, it delays things. It makes the state and the settlers, to slow down or to have to explain them, or even under apartheid law to work in under some kind of mechanism. And it's very clear that for the settlers, this law, the bill that was passed last Monday, but also a set of different laws, is a way to do annexation de facto, and they're not really hiding it. They're already in the current government, they have so much power, budgets, and nobody's paying attention to what they're doing. So they're already building new outposts and expecting settlement and so on, and killing Palestinians on a daily basis. But it seemed that with this law, they won't have any barrier, and they could take over more lands, and even private lands and so on. And it's, for me, it's very clear, and I think also for others, that Palestinians and also will be the first to suffer from this when everything is open and the government doesn't have anything, even if it's technical or bureaucratical or doesn't really work. If the government will have nothing to stop it, it's clear. And even in case of house demolitions or planning in Israel, in the Nakab, in the Galilee, where the government is also fully now offering to Judaize the space. So it's clear that this will be, and they're not hiding it. So ultra-Orthodox parties maybe want this overhaul in order to establish the fact they don't have to go to the army and they can study instead, and for other reasons. But the settler movement, it's clear they want this set of laws to continue promoting apartheid and separation and two sets of laws.
Very important points. Vera, would you like to add to that?
Maybe take another question.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So yeah, and just to also note that we've actually had some recent analysis reporting precisely talking about how Palestinians are so central to the judicial coup, like it cannot be separated in any sense. So we encourage you to see some of those articles. So quite a few questions we've been getting are actually regarding the United States, and they're thinking about it. But I'm curious to hear your response about what is the role of the U.S. and of American citizens and the public and organizations, etc., in what has been unfolding on the ground. I know, Oren, for example, you reported from Tumus Aya, which you were mentioning. There are many Palestinians with American citizenship, and they also got a diplomatic visit, and also got some attention because of their background. But I'm curious also what you got the sense of, how people were there, were experiencing it, if that shifted any conversation. And also, Vera, you yourself obviously following a lot of international and American media. You've also lived in the United States and sort of observed and still observe, the conversations that Americans have about this. So whether in the kind of, the media, the media landscape, or the policy, or even just the general American public, where are you seeing the United States is playing its role in all that's happening, and what can Americans also potentially do to try to shift that dynamic differently? Let's start with Vera. That's all right.
Well, the US has a lot to do. I know that, for example, I want to encourage Jewish American activism. Having Jewish American allies is a game changer, I think, because when I lived in the US about 8 years ago, there was that activism, and I'm seeing how that activism actually, if not anything on the ground, boosts the morale of Palestinians in their fight to justice. Let's start with the need for me as a Palestinian journalist for the US to actually condemn the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist, who is an American citizen. Not just condemnation, we need actual steps on the ground to see that there were consequences for killing such a journalists. We need the US to pressure the Israeli government to end apartheid in the first place. But let's start with the smaller things like the tax money that the US sends in funding to Israel. The number escapes me, but it's a huge number. Just the way the US treats the Israeli government directly affects Palestinians, whether inside Israel, in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. So our lives and livelihood is directly connected to the relationships between the US and Israel. There needs to be mounting pressure from internationally to pressure the US to actually hold Israel accountable in its crimes, in killing Palestinians, in imprisoning kids, in putting Palestinians under administrative detentions for years, in all the crimes that I can list here until tomorrow morning. It doesn't start anywhere and doesn't end anywhere. It's a process of pressuring the US government in very available ways, from continuing its criminal occupation apartheid towards Palestine.
Oren, do you have anything to add on that front as well?
Just maybe a short comment, I think, and this is the idea Ron Rappaport, our colleague, who wrote about recently, is that it seems as long as and it's about the US, but also European countries. So as long as Israel internally was kind of a democracy, at least for Israelis or for white people, it seems it was very easy for the US and other countries to separate. So they demand two-state solution and other things, but they treat Israel as a normal state, or even in a better way. And now actually there's an interesting process, and we have to see how it follows, that with this overhaul and with Israel going to taking undemocratic steps, even towards Jewish middle-class white Israeli, it's a question how it continues and how it's taken from there, but there's definitely some shift.
All very important observations. Thank you. We have another question, and this relates to some things we were saying earlier, but someone was asking about during the invasion of Jenin at the beginning of the month, did Israeli protesters kind of register or incorporate that military operation into its messaging in the protest? I think, like Oren, you were mentioning how much Hawara, for example, back in February, the separate program there, how much that really kind of it was inserted into a lot of the Israeli protest messaging and the movement, and how it's kind of also shaped people in sort of radical ways, and also kind of more some manipulative ways. But I'm curious, like, also, if you saw similar effects around Jenin, did it register very little? Did people get in line with just sort of like a military argument? I'm curious how you observed that.
Yes, I think it exactly shows you the difference between settler violence and pogrom, that it's kind of easier for people to condemn or to relate that this is like something that is happening outside the authority, outside the government, even though people recognize it's backed up and the Israeli state is not doing something else, and then to a military operation by the state. So I think if we've seen a shift in Hawara, we've seen less shift, or much less shift, in opinion during the Jenin operation, and we've seen the radical bloc and the anti-occupation bloc still protesting during the weekly anti-government protests in Tel Aviv, and also doing a few hundreds of people, like a separate protest, as we've seen in other places. But definitely we haven't seen it, at least for the Israeli public, we haven't seen this shift yet. There's still this separation. I think the Hawara, and this, it starts to change it a bit, that also people realize that Hawara and Tumusai was done, it's backed up by the state and supported by the state, and even the weapons the settlers carry are provided by the state. But still, to the mainstream Israeli public, there's still some separation between what extreme settlers do and what the military does.
Vera, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to add something really quick. It also has to do with the settler violence being against civilians who are unarmed, Palestinians, and the military operation being against resistant fighters, Palestinian resistant fighters inside the camp. And that brings me to say that even though I hear many people condemn the Palestinian resistant fighter, and I see the hypocrisy in looking at resistant fighters, for example, in Ukraine, but not in Palestine, praising them and not praising Palestinians, we have to also look at what brought those really young men to carry weapons and fight Israel. I'm not justifying what they're doing. I'm just trying to understand how did we end up with the armed cells and different groups in cities in the West Bank, like the Lion's Den in Nablus that many people have heard about. What exactly happened for these young men to carry weapons? Well, when there's occupation and there is an authority that helps the occupation, you're left alone to fend for yourself. And I think Israelis, before international audience, need to understand that, and as much as it's hard to humanize that.
This actually segues into another one of the questions we've been getting, and we've also been hearing quite a bit about these Palestinian armed resistance groups and how they've been, how they've evolved and how they're quite different from also the past, and how much that armed resistance is also taking, has become so dominant, especially over the past year and a half or more. I'm curious, actually, Vera, if you can unpack that a little bit, what you've been seeing in terms of sort of especially Palestinian conversations around these armed groups. What is making them different from the past? Why are they emerging exactly in this context? I'm wondering if you could dissect that a little bit more. And also, Oren, I know you also, a couple months ago, for example, when there was a major kind of closure in the Nablus area, also against Lion's Den, also curious to hear your own sort of perspectives on how that's all been playing out between the army and the settlers and these armed groups. So Vera, if we can start with you, and then Oren.
I think what's different is the fact that they're not affiliated with the political factions, Palestinian political factions. What we have seen in the past is lone wolves or even cells that are affiliated with Hamas, affiliated with Islamic Jihad. The story is different with the current cells or fighters who we've seen carry out numerous attacks at Israeli army posts in the West Bank, which again, it's an occupying power. And what's different that people, I see the Palestinian street kind of like have some empathy towards them because again, these young men who carry weapons, they know they're risking their lives. If they're not being killed, they will soon be arrested because of the intelligence and the different cameras and even the old-fashioned ways of planting. Sorry, the word escaped. Collaborators. So they know they're gonna end up dead or serving a life sentence in an Israeli jail, and we saw in Nablus that the Palestinian Authority offered the Lions Den fighters to be imprisoned and in Palestinian Authority prisons, which is not a lot better than Israeli jails. And I see public support because we lack leadership. I can tell you that the majority of Palestinians don't see the PA or Hamas as their leaders. And people in the West Bank, Palestinians in the West Bank, they lack protection. They lack everything they would love to see in an army or a protection by the PA forces. So that's why I think people are supporting these cells more than ever.
And Oren, any last thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it also shows that all the different methods Israel is using against these armed groups is not really succeeding. So last year in Nablus, we had a closure of 10 days, which Israel was checking all the checkpoints, but literally setting checkpoints around the city of, with the villages around 300,000 people, and locking them down for 10 days, checking slowly car by car to collectively punish them. But I think, I don't know if it's intentionally or unintentionally, but all the Israeli actions are just making this group stronger. When Israel assassinates or an 18-year-old member of the Lions Den, like happened, and then publish for political gain, we killed a senior member of a terror group. So, I remember the second Intifada. Back then, when a senior member was somebody who carried out, 20 suicide attacks inside Israeli city and killed dozens of Israelis. So also Israel, in some way, again, I don't have inside information to say, but also Israel, by assassinating some of these people, very young people, and then calling them leaders or senior members of terror groups or resistant groups, they're building this ethos, they're building their name, and they're just encouraging more and more people to join and to follow this. And of course, as we've seen from the second Intifada and the first Intifada and all that, of course, it's kind of obvious to say, but of course, there's no military solution to that, even from a military. So the Jenin operation, okay, there was the political gain for Netanyahu, but if you look from a military perspective, they caused a lot of damage. They killed people that is not clear if they were involved. Some of them were involved in resistance. Some of them maybe were bypassed. They destroyed family, destroyed homes, destroyed infrastructure. But in the end of the day, when you come and look what they present, the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence, they caught a few guns. When we're talking of thousands of guns across the West Bank, most of them arrived or stolen by criminal organization from the army and the police, and then brought into the West Bank. And so in the end of a 3 days operation, the biggest in the West Bank, they don't show any result from their side. It's not that they caught anyone important. It's not that they confiscate weapons. And the day after, you had all the armed groups made a parade or kind of a march in Jenin of hundreds of people going out and saying, we are still here, we were not going anywhere. So I think it's something that is meant to fail, and it's very obvious.
Thank you both for that. And I think what you've all described really is kind of painting this accurate picture of, what usually in the public discourse, we talk about this idea of a status quo that exists, and especially when it's been existing for the past at least 10, 20 years. But the status quo isn't one of that everything is kind of frozen in place. It's actually a status quo of power dynamics, in which this larger structure is still in place of occupation, of apartheid. And these are everything we've been talking about that's been developing over this past month, and let alone years, they, like we said, these are not isolated events. Everything is connected, whether it is about Israeli military operations in the West Bank, which are also learning from Israeli policies of control and domination in the Gaza Strip. Also things of the judicial coup, what is occurring now by the far-right government leading against Israeli citizens and trying to strip their rights and the rights of the Supreme Court, has also been experienced by Palestinian citizens, and how all these things interplay among each other, both politically, psychologically, socially, economically, and everything. And it's these connecting of the dots that is absolutely crucial, and that I'm really glad that Vera and Oren have been able to do so. We can always go on much more about these topics, but I really want to thank both Vera and Oren for their incredible insights. I highly encourage everyone to go on to 972 magazine to look at their articles and their reporting, as well as all the articles we've been producing, and also for all Hebrew readers and speakers to also visit our partner site, Local Call, which also produces its own materials and also cross-posts with 972. So also a very valuable resource to look into. And you can also, of course, follow 972 on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where you can stay up to date, and especially our newsletter. We have usually 2 newsletters that we send out each week. One is called The Landline, which is usually like some analysis or an article that goes straight to your inbox, and also the Sunday recap, where we collect all our articles of the week. So we highly encourage you to sign up to those newsletters, especially as social media goes through its very peculiar experience of late. And last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, the work that we do at 972 is one piece of many different efforts and initiatives that are here on the ground to affect a positive change for Palestinians and Israelis. And we really want to invite you and encourage you to support 972 magazine, whether through one-time donations or to become members. The kind of journalism that you've been hearing from Vera and Oren and many of our other colleagues and members of our site and contributing writers really depends on people like you who support us. We are an independent organization that relies on those followers to keep us afloat. Every cent that you provide really is very, very valuable. And so we really invite you to explore our website and to see our platform for memberships or for donations, if you like. Your support really goes a very, very long way to have more events like this, to keep bringing fantastic journalists to write for us, to hopefully even in the future revive our podcast, which requires also resources and support. So everything you guys are able to give, and even just to amplify our voices in any way, really, really goes a long way. And with that, thank you again, Vera and Oren. I want to thank also Hagai Matar, our executive director, for being our master behind the scenes, keeping everything afloat. And you can find a recording of this conversation on Facebook and also soon on our YouTube channel. And it will be available to rewatch or to share with others. So thank you all very, very much. I wish you very good health and spirits for this evening or this day. And we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Amjad.
Amjad, thank you, everyone.